Interesting. Okay, good evening, gentlemen. We're here for another week of no lecture notes, no texts, and no holds barred. Lecture prep is neither here nor there. I can't comment on that. Less than there should be. Let's put it that way. I wanted this week to talk about Eisav and Yishmael. Parshas told us, connected to the Parsha, connected to current events, connected to all the things we've been talking about in recent classes, an apt topic. The Rebbe has multiple sichas, even just in the Likutei Sichos, even just in the edited sichos of the Rebbe. There are multiple sichos about Eisav. Very beautiful, redemptive sichos, finding the positive, finding the good in Eisav, and explaining the whole story. Of course, this week's Parsha centers around, as all the kids in Hebrew school know, what happens in this week's Parsha. We have the blessing. Yaakov gets the blessing from Yitzchak, and really that's what the whole Parsha revolves around. That's the primary story of this week's Parsha. And it's really the only Parsha that is about Yitzchak, really. We find out the main things we find out about Yitzchak are, we already had the Akedah. Last week we had the story of Yitzchak getting married, which barely involved Yitzchak. This week we have the two things that we say about Yitzchak that he did himself, which is he dug the wells and he gave the blessings to his sons. These are the primary stories about Yitzchak in this week's Parsha. Then we're already on to the life of Yaakov next week, which you notice is told in much more detail. One of the Rebbe's sichos this week, it's a very good week to learn all the sichos. In terms of, in what I mean by that is, in terms of understanding what goes on in the Parsha, there's an unusually high percentage of sichos this week about what actually goes on in the Parsha, meaning not about a Rashi or this or that. If you learn the Likutei Sichos for this week's Parsha, you get a lot of like what is actually happening in the story, in the progression of the book of Bereshis, all sorts of very interesting things. The Rebbe has a very famous, to me anyway, sicha this week about the parallels between Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and the Baal Shem Tov, the Maggid of Mezrich, and the Alter Rebbe. There's another sicha that's this week that's very beautiful, talking about how the miraculous fact that the three forefathers of Chassidus, who parallel Kabbalistically the three forefathers, the three patriarchs of Judaism, both of them were alive at the same time for 15 years. That's what the whole Sikha is about. Avraham Avinu passes away when Yaakov is 15 years old, and the Baal Shem Tov passed away when the Alter Rebbe was 15 years old. Anyway.
Really? I never heard that before.
Yeah, look at this. Check it out.
Only Chabad would probably know something like that.
Well, of course, experts in the Alter Rebbe, focused on Alter Rebbe. But I want to talk about. I'm focusing in on a single sikha of the Rebbe. I'll probably add other things that are less good, but the central part will be the sikha of the Rebbe. Less good because they're more going to be, I guess, my interpretations. What can you say? But the core of what I want to talk about is the Sikha of the Rebbe and Chelek Tazvav Likutei Sichos, the 15th volume of Likutei Sichos about Yitzchak and Yishmael. The parsha is called Toldos. Eila Toldos Yitzchak. Says Rashi, Ve'ela Toldos Yitzchak. Says Rashi, why Ve'ela? Because the continuation of what we were talking about at the end of last week's parsha. What were we talking about at the end of last week's parsha? Yishmael and Yishmael's children, right? The sons of Yishmael. It's the end of last week's parsha. So this is a continuation. We're now talking about Yitzchak. And what's the continuation? We're going to talk about Eisav, says Rashi, right? So last week we ended last week talking about Yishmael. Now we're going to talk about Eisav. The Rebbe asks the obvious question, the klutz kasha. How can you say that a whole parsha, which is about the descendants of Yitzchak, and of course we know that Toldos doesn't just mean descendants, it also means deeds, actions, his impact, his whole legacy. How can you say it's reflected in Eisav, right? On the contrary, as we know, the whole parsha the whole Torah is going to switch focus to Yaakov. We'll see Eisav again in a confrontation between Yaakov and Eisav. But of course, the primary topic is going to become Yaakov. So how could you say that the Toldos of Yitzchak really is Eisav? Right. That's what Rashi says at the beginning of the parasha. So in order to explain this, the answer is, in one word, the answer is that Eisav and Yitzchak have a special relationship. There's a special connection between Yitzchak and Eisav. But to understand this connection, we have to take a broader picture. And really, it's by contrasting with Yishmael. The Rebbe goes over the various opinions about they are mentioned. In other words, there's various opinions about exactly what was the nature of Yishmael and the nature of Eisav. The Rebbe, I think, follows the majority opinions, which are based on two different Gemaras, if I recall correctly, one in Baba Basra, I forget what the other one is, about the nature of Eisav and Yishmael. And you find a very, very interesting thing about Eisav and Yishmael. First of all, we don't go out from the pshat, right? We don't go out from the simple meaning of the Torah. And the simple meaning of the Torah is what the Jewish children know in Hebrew school, as I always say in this class. And what do the Jewish children know in Hebrew school? We know that we're not very fond of Eisav or Yishmael, right? It's not exactly, these are not, in our stories, these are not heroes of the Torah. These are two no-goodniks, as we would say in English, right? They're no-goodniks. Anti-heroes, interesting interpretation. But they're not in the fold. They're not seen as very good. And the reason for this is quite simple, because according to the pshat of the Torah, the simple reading of the Torah mentions in multiple different places that in fact they are not very good people. They're departures from their forefathers. They're departures. Yishmael was a departure from Avraham. Eisav was a departure from Yitzchak. And they're not really in the fold. When you look at the Gemara makes an interesting distinction. Fundamentally, and again, there is a bit of machlokes about this, but this is the tack that the Rebbe takes. The Rebbe is following, so to speak, this view of the dichotomy. The dichotomy is as follows. Yishmael is really not considered to be in the fold at all. Yishmael is, so to speak, a non-Jew. If Avraham is the first Jew, a matter itself of some controversy and doubt, if Avraham is, as opposed to Yitzchak, right? If Avraham is the first Jew, Yishmael is not a Jew. Yishmael was never in the first place part of that people, right? In other words, the principle of what born a Jew, always a Jew, didn't exist yet, according to many opinions, at the time when Yishmael was born. The creation of Jewish heredity and Jewish, which in Chassidus, of course, we explains, follows after the transmission of the godly soul, which we receive as an inheritance from our forefathers, starting from Avraham, right? That inheritance was not bequeathed to Yishmael. Yishmael is not in the fold. Yishmael is not part of the people. The people is formed between, according to the most common interpretation, between Avraham and Yitzchak. Yitzchak is the heir. Yitzchak is the continuation and the furtherance, and the only furtherance of Avraham, even though Avraham has all these other children, right? The main continuance, the inheritor, the people, comes through Yitzchak, correct? And the opposite about Yishmael. Yishmael is distant from being the Zerah of Avraham. He's not the true continuation of Avraham. The simple meaning of the simple, like the child in Hebrew school would understand very simply. You would say, and there's truth to this, even though it's not actually so simple. But there is truth to this idea, which is if you read the story at the simple level, he's a child of Hagar, not of Sarah, right? Now, Avram's other children are the children of Keturah, not of Sarah, right? They're not really the children of Sarah. The reason why it's not so simple, of course, is because, as we're going to see by Yaakov, that Yaakov has children from concubines and they stay in the fold. So it's not so simple. But at the end of the day, this is the simplest, so to speak, at the very most basic level, right? It's not through Sarah, but rather from Hagar. It's only Sarah's child who is the continuation of the beginning of the Jewish people.
What's that? In the Kedah it says es bincha es yechidecha.
Correct.
So
what
it
is
seems that he's not his son at all.
right? Well, Rashi says that Yechidcha. Yeah, if you go through the famous thing in Rashi, right, where Hashem has to make all these qualifications because Avraham is still trying to find a way that it could apply to Yishmael, as the children also learn, by the way, in Hebrew school, right? The famous Rashis on the beginning of the Akedah, right? That's why he has to make all these clarifications. Your only son, the one you love, right? He has to, in other words, Hashem has to kind of like nudge Avraham into saying, no, it's actually Yitzchak, not Yishmael. Yeah. So in other words, that could go either way, I guess you could say. But the interesting thing about Yishmael is that the Gemara says that Yishmael at the end of his life does tshuva. Yishmael repents at the end of his life. He's not a no-goodnik forever. That's what they don't tell the kids in Hebrew school. At the end of his life, Yishmael does tshuva. Probably the most logical reason why would be under the influence of Avraham, right? And this goes back to the Hasidic teachings about the very nature of Keturah as well, right? In other words, Avraham was eventually able to be peda and to redeem and to elevate, right, all of these other children and his wife Hagar, and was able to basically elevate all of them and lift them up eventually. And Yishmael, at the end of his life, says the Gemara, Yishmael did tshuva. My class is organized that now I'm going to talk about Eisav from the beginning, and we'll get to Eisav. No, that's okay. It's no holds barred. I'm going to forget the things that I wanted to say. Eisav, by contrast, very interestingly, is the opposite. Eisav is, according to many opinions, again, complicated, he's a Yisrael Mumar, right? He is a Jew that rejects his Judaism fundamentally, because he's a child of Yitzchak and Rivka, of course. He's the twin to Yaakov. So in other words, he has the same, what would we call it? He has the same fundamentals of his identity as our forefather Jacob, father of all the Jewish people. But it doesn't work out. Esau ends up rejecting his Jewish identity to whatever extent such a thing is possible, and he's like a Jew who got caught up in supporting Hamas, something like that, right? A very serious departure, a serious rejection of Jewish identity, of the Jewish future with the Jews. Very, very serious and sad situation. But nevertheless, as we say, he was born a Jew, so he's always a Jew in a profound sense. He's a child of Yitzchak. At the end of his life, Eisav does not do tshuva. At the end of his life, Eisav does not do tshuva. On the contrary, Ronnie says his head ends up getting buried with Yitzchak, but you have to realize the context of the story is he's trying to prevent the whole process. That's what happens, and they get in a fight, right? And one of Yaakov's grandchildren, I believe, right, ends up cutting off Uncle Esav's head. Yeah, the great Uncle Eisav. So the whole idea is that Eisav, till the very end, is still fighting with the children of Yaakov. He's bitter till the end, despite the fact that fundamentally, in the view of the Torah, Eisav has a closer relationship to the Jewish people. Yishmael was never Jewish in the first place. Eisav was born with a Jewish soul. He was born as part of the Jewish people. He was a child of Yitzchak. The Jewish people had begun already from Yitzchak, according to all opinions. And yet, he is bitter and he's fighting till the end.
I think.
Yeah. No, please.
I don't know what's the style over here.
No, go for it.
You see that kind of also, I think, in the way of, Eisav, I think, would be identified as the Western values, right?
Yeah.
The Western world.
Yes.
And they are the only people in the world that believe in the Bible. They study the Bible and believe in the Bible, right? Whereas the Ishmaelites, they don't even have the Bible. They just, Allah Akbar, whatever. They have their book.
Interesting.
They don't learn the Bible.
Interesting idea. Yeah, interesting contrast. Perhaps you could say so. Binyamin is referring to the concept, which a lot of people don't know, that Edom comes from Eisav, and from Edom you have Rome, and basically the entire Western civilization and the exile, the Roman exile, which is the exile in which we are still in, the long exile, the 2,000-year exile, is fundamentally Roman and fundamentally therefore derives from Edom, which therefore derives from Eisav. So Eisav, the quality of Eisav is the quality of of Western civilization, really, in the long view. It's the quality of Western civilization. It's interesting that a lot of Jews talk about how the Arabs, who famously are the Yishmaelites and have a tradition that they come from Arabs, who are famously from Yishmael and have a tradition that they are the descendants of Yishmael, and we view them as our cousins, but in fact they're our second cousins. Esav's a closer cousin, if you think about it. Interesting. Yeah. So there may be something to that. There's very interesting characterizations. You can learn a lot. There's a lot of Chassidus about the qualities of the four different exiles, which is really a lens through which you can view. There's a rabbi, his name is Jeremy Kagan, who's written some very interesting articles and books. Not a Chabadnik, but a student of a very passionate student of the Maharal of Prague, right? So maybe through a back door, a little bit of a Chabadnik, right? We'll claim him. Yeah, he's a cousin. He's a close one. Closer than Yishmael to us, closer than Eisav to us, much closer. Just joking, of course. The Maharal and his what some call proto-Chassidus of the Maharal, which is neither here nor there, but the Maharal of Prague writes very beautifully and at length about the spiritual qualities of the four different exiles, right? It's a debate what the four exiles are. First of all, whether Mitzrayim counts as the first one, so the whole thing, right? But through analyzing the four exiles, you actually get a very profound understanding of the Jewish view of history, right? Because especially according to the Kabbalistic view, which is the Maharal's view, right? The unfolding of the four exiles is four fundamental oppositions to God and to Judaism, right? Which is why they're exiles. And by understanding those oppositions, you understand that each one has a profoundly different quality, right? In other words, the human soul, in the view of the Maharal, and I think you could extend this to the Maimarim and Chassidus as well, the human soul changed and worked differently. There was a whole new level, corresponding to new revelations in the Torah as well, by the way. There's a whole new opposition and a whole new quality of soul that developed historically at the time of let's say, the Greek exile, as opposed to the earlier Egyptian exile, and as opposed to the Babylonian exile, and as opposed to the Roman exile. There's a whole new layer, right? And so by understanding these layers, you can understand something that's very important. This is a bit of a diversion and was not my intention to talk about, but it's important. So we'll talk about, I just want to touch on it, right? You understand something very important, which is that in the view of Judaism, human, Jewish, and by extension, human phenomenology, I'll explain this, I'll translate this to Hebrew in a moment. Phenomenology is not the same over time. Phenomenology is a very fancy word for something very simple. It means the quality of experience, right? In other words, in the view of Yiddishkeit, and especially according to Kabbalah, right? An ancient Babylonian looking out at a field with trees and a blue sky profoundly saw something different in a very profound sense than, say, an ancient Greek looking at the same scene, right? Which is very different than we especially, because it's a very long exile, the Roman exile, and it just proceeds and we just get further and further into this state of mind, right? Sees it very different than us.
We had different TV shows back then.
Different TV shows, yeah. Different, the very foundation of perception, right? Not necessarily that they saw the sky to be a different color than we do, right? It's more subtle than that. It's more the interpretation, the assignment of meaning, which in some ways is pre-conscious thought and real rationality, right? The assignment of meaning to these things. And there's many different Gemaras and different things that support this contention, right? Like, for example, which we mentioned just a few weeks ago, we mentioned the idea that the desire for idol worship was removed from the world, right? So very much a related idea, right? What was this ancient spirituality, where they saw the world so differently that the temptation to worship idols, and also, by the way, the capacity for prophecy, the temptation to worship idols and the capacity for prophecy descend together, right? Their capacity for great spiritual heights of prophecy and for great spiritual depths of idol worship was much greater. What does that mean, right? It doesn't just mean that there's like some switch that was flicked on or off. It means everything was different, right? When they looked at a tree, they saw something that was worthy of worshiping as an asherah, right? As an idol, right? Whereas when we look at a tree, we see something very different, and it's a very subtle and profound thing. Why is it important to understand this? It's important to understand this because it's very dangerous to assume that we make a lot of assumptions. It's very dangerous to not be aware of our assumptions about how the world around us works. And the historical view can be very, the historical view of events can be very dry and very godless, very against the idea of God being involved in history and all of these sorts of things. When you realize that it's quite possible that God's involvement of history was historically quite different, right, than ours, it opens up all sorts of interesting possibilities that to a very Roman, post-Roman, thousands of years post-Roman worldview may not be as obvious. This is a whole other discussion. There's some very interesting books about it. It's worth looking into, right? When we say believing in God, right, according to when you say those words in the Roman English, right, and they refer to a certain thing, to an ancient Babylonian they would have referred to something very different qualitatively, right? And it's an exercise in subtlety and requires a great imagination to understand those differences over time. Anyway, back to Yishmael and Eisav. The question is, Yishmael, of course. Yeah.
That means that the redemption or the Mashiach at that time would manifest in a different way.
Absolutely. There's no question. And those galuses were redeemed from, right? Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who redeemed them from Mitzrayim, right? And from Bavel they came with Ezra Sefer and that whole era of the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, etc. And then you had the galus of Greece, where this is the whole story of Hanukkah, right? If you want to count it as one of the galuses, as I said, it's a machlekes of what exactly. But you have the Greek galus, and the Greek galus, the answer was the Maccabees, Matisyahu, etc., right? Maybe the most famous example, because it's the one, I guess, aside from the Egypt and Pesach, obviously, the next famous is the Greeks and the Maccabees. And then the Roman exile is going to have a specifically Roman Mashiach. In the Gemara, when it talks about meeting Mashiach, and you have the famous story about Hayom and B'Kol Tishmo, right? Eliyahu Hanavi sends the rabbi, I forget it off the top of my head which one, if someone knows, they can remind me. He sends one of the, I believe a Tana, one of the Tanaim, to go, and he asks Eliyahu Hanavi, where's Mashiach? So he sends him, he says he's outside of the gates of Rome and he's a leper, and the way you know it's him is because he only unwraps one of his wrappings one at a time, which itself is, the whole thing is of course full of meaning. But he goes and he meets Mashiach and he asks Mashiach, when are you coming? And Mashiach says, Hayom, today. So the rabbi gets very excited and he does his whole preparations, and the day passes, and of course the final Redeemer has not arrived. So he goes back to Eliyahu Hanavi and he says, what gives? I'm translating from the Babylonian. He says, what gives, Eliyahu Hanavi? Eliyahu Hanavi tells him, right, what does he mean? He means Hayom, like the verse says, Hayom im b'kol tishmo. Today, if you listen to his voice. Yeah, that whole famous story. So I just wanted to point out that in that story, where is Mashiach? Mashiach is at the gates of Rome, right? In other words, the Mashiach from this exile, which they at that time didn't know would continue for 2,000 years, presumably, right? The Redeemer from this exile, in a profound sense, right, comes from there. In a profound sense, the Catholic Church, which was undeniably the temporal, in other words, the worldly dominating factor in this exile for many centuries, right, was based in Rome. Now you could say that perhaps it's not, so it's a whole question. Even the exiles in exile, everything's all confused and upside down, which the Rebbe said all the time about many things. But anyway, the which is not necessarily such a bad thing. That itself is a whole other story. Anyway, the Rebbe has a Torah, by the way, about Hayomim B'Kol Tishmo, right? The Rebbe has a beautiful, just very quickly, the Rebbe has a beautiful question and answer, right? The question is, he goes to Mashiach and he says, when are you coming? Mashiach says, today, right? So the Rebbe asks the question, why is Mashiach allowed to say just today? In other words, what kind of ripoff is that? Like, in other words, like it's like playing a prank on him. Is Mashiach playing a prank on the rabbi? You have to qualify. And the Rebbe says, even al pi halacha, right? If you're selling something, if you're telling someone something and there's a condition, right? The way of tzedek and yosher, the way of honesty, and according to halacha, when you sell something, it should be this way. You should actually say the tanai first, right? So that they don't have even a second where they're misled, right? You say the condition first. Mashiach actually sort of said, "Im b'kolei tishmo hayom" would be the most honest way of saying it, right? Because that way, there's not even a second where you think he would just say hayom, right? It's im b'kolei tishmo hayom. You should say, if you listen to my voice, if you listen to God's voice today. So why did he just say today? And he doesn't even mention the condition, right? The Rebbe says, from this we learn that from the Mashiach's perspective, today is always the day. In other words, from the Mashiach's perspective, the Mashiach coming is inherent to the world. It's not that something has to happen to bring Mashiach. From Mashiach's perspective, the world is always immediately on the precipice, and his coming is always immediate, right? Once the day passes and Mashiach hasn't come, then you have to search for explanations. How could it be? It's an unnatural thing that Mashiach hasn't come, so then you need a whole Torah which explains to you it's only Hayom im b'kolei tishmo. That's the explanation. But fundamentally, right, mitzad Mashiach, the Rebbe taught Mashiach is inherent to nature. Mashiach is always coming today. Right? It's only if things go wrong that Mashiach's not coming today. So it's not, in other words, it's without conditions. Mashiach is always immediately going to be coming today. Sometimes if something goes wrong, sometimes it doesn't come today. Anyway. Yep, sometimes. You have to have a
Positivity.
It's not just positivity. It's more profound than positivity. It has to do with how we look at tshuva and how we look at nature and how we look at the very nature of inductive logic. Do they have the word inductive logic in Hebrew? Higayon inductivi. Inductivi, yeah, exactly. I knew there was a Hebrew word for it. The higayon inductivi. So it's you studied philosophy in college, right? So you know all the Hebrew words. So it's a more profound and subtle thing, which has very important implications about the nature of tshuva. The Rebbe speaks about it all the time, right? It has to do with the way that the past has the ability to impact the future, and how really fundamentally the way we should be living is not where we see the past as a real thing. The past is not really binding in a very real way, with the whole of Chassidus's worldview and metaphysics and view of God and understanding of nature backs up this notion, right, that things can change immediately. The past and its reality and its bearing on the future, when the past is negative, right, is not really real. But it's a whole other. You guys want a different class tonight. That's what you want. I will not be distracted. That much. We have Yishmael and Eisav.
I want to hear Yishmael and Eisav.
I'm on it. So again, to get us back on track here, Yishmael is not a Jew fundamentally in this view, but however, at the end of his life, he becomes an ois no goodnik. He ceases to be a no goodnik. Yishmael passes away a righteous man. Eisav is the opposite. Eisav fundamentally is Jewish. He's part of the nation in a profound sense, even though he deeply rejects it in a way similar to nowadays. You would say that someone joined another religion, God forbid, or something like that, even though they were born Jewish. He profoundly rejects that identity. But nevertheless, he is born Jewish. He has a Jewish identity to reject. But at the end of his life, despite that identity, he is still fighting with his brother and with his nephews and his grandnephews. Eisav is still against. He's a no goodnik till the end. Yeah. What explains this discrepancy? And like I said before, you can't use the simple explanation that one is born of Hagar and the other is born of Rivka, right? That's the simple Hebrew school explanation. But the truth is, it's not enough, because we see Yaakov immediately afterwards, right, has Bilhah and Zilpah, and all of his 12 sons are all in the fold, and his daughter as well, right, are all in the fold. And furthermore, al pi halacha, there's an even more subtle issue, right? Which actually, this is another theme in Likutei Sichos that runs through the Rebbe's whole explanation of the book of Genesis, which is fascinating, because the Rebbe always has a few different sichos about how the Avos balanced their commitment to what they knew Judaism would become versus their commitment to the Sheva Mitzvahs B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide laws. Right? It's the Rebbe's famous explanation of why Yaakov is allowed to marry 2 sisters, which a Jew is not allowed to do, right? Because Judaism's ban on marrying 2 sisters was merely a voluntary decision of Yaakov, in the same way that all of the forefathers voluntarily kept Judaism, even though they weren't obligated to. Whereas the promises that Yaakov made to each to marry them, right, before the deception with Lavan, right, promises are obligated under the 7 Noahide laws. So in other words, Yaakov had a superseding obligation to marry the 2 sisters, even though he knew that one day the Torah will be given at Mount Sinai, and they will be told not to marry 2 sisters. The Rebbe's beautiful explanation, a whole halachic explanation, a rich sicha about why Yaakov is allowed to marry 2 sisters. So similarly here, it appears that under under halacha, these Hagar and also Bilhah and Zilpah would be legitimate. They would be legit. Those marriages would be legitimate to confer full Yerusha, full inheritance. So in other words, it would seem that there must be another reason. That's not the reason. Yishmael's mother is not the reason that he's not considered a Jew. It's more subtle than that. So really, according to Chassidus, the way you understand these 2 things is that it's the difference between the Aveda of Avraham and Yitzchak. It's the difference between these 2 forefathers, because Avraham works on Yishmael and Yishmael is his child and student. Eisav is the child and student of Yaakov. By the way, in Judaism, who do we generally... of Yitzchak, thank you. Of his father, Yitzchak. It's going to get confusing. In Judaism, by the way, who do we view in general as worse, Yishmael or Eisav? The answer...
Like Eisav, actually attacking directly.
Yeah, the Rebbe says...
Try to kill him.
The Rebbe says, in general, we have a poorer view of Eisav than of Yishmael in Judaism, in general. And in fact, an interesting factoid to think about, in the Gemara, you famously have Rabbi Yishmael, right? But Eisav, it seems, was never a Jewish name. Never heard of any Jew that was named Esau or Eisav, right? But in the times of the Talmud, very interestingly, you have Rabbi Yishmael, which nowadays would be very controversial, but in the times of the Talmud was apparently normal that a rabbi should be named Yishmael. Anyway, the difference between Yishmael and Eisav is really because of the difference between Avraham and Yitzchak. Their fathers' different ways of serving God produced 2 different results in these 2 sons. And really, this gives a profound insight into the difference between the divine traits, chesed and gevura, right? Or chesed and din. Because we know, and in fact it's not even from the Kabbalah, it's from the Midrash already and from the Gemara, we already know that Avraham is associated with chesed, and Yitzchak is associated with gvura or din, with judgment, right? In Kabbalah, of course, these are the 2 primary emotive spheres, the two of the primary qualities or traits of God are kindness and versus severity and judgment, which you see reflected in the difference between the life story of Avraham and Yitzchak. Avraham wanders. Avraham goes and spreads knowledge of the one God all over the place, all over the world. He starts outside the land of Canaan, then he comes to Canaan, and then he goes down from Canaan to Egypt, and he comes back from Egypt. Avraham goes all over the place, spreading the awareness of the one God. Yitzchak famously remains in one place. He never leaves the land of Canaan. And when he remains in one place, what does he do? He digs wells. That's what he does in the one place that he remains. This is the fundamental difference between Avraham and Yitzchak. When people explain the difference between chesed and gvura, kindness versus discipline or severity or authority or judgment, all different translations, the simple explanation that you learn when you first start learning Chassidus is that chesed means to give over. Kindness means you give over with an open hand, you give to others. Gvura means withholding of giving, right? The truth is much more subtle. It's much more profound, because the truth is that giving versus not giving, or being versus non-being, you would say, have much deeper roots in Kabbalah. You would really, a studied Kabbalist would probably say, assign a different pair to that dichotomy, not Chesed and Gvura. Chesed and Gvura are already defined within the 10 spheres, the 10 traits, which are all inter-included one with another. It's not this stark, this absolute difference between being and non-being. Giving and non-giving really doesn't belong in the 10 spheres. The 10 spheres are much more defined and complex in their way than that. Really, I think a much better, and with this we'll understand the Rebbe explains the whole Sikha in this way. Kindness, I believe we talked about this in our Tanya class as well. The trait of chesed, or kindness, means that what's the primary desire, the primary fulfillment? The primary fulfillment is the ability to spread. Right? To spread, to be given over to others. When Avraham doesn't have guests, right? Avraham is suffering. Right? It's the fulfillment of Avraham, who is an Isha Chesed, is a man of kindness. What is the manifestation or the culmination, the fulfillment of kindness? It's the ability to give to others. That's the whole focus. Note, not about how others will receive. That's a different question. It's the ability to give to others. I'm not so concerned about how they take it. I'm just more concerned that they take it, right? There has to be someone else to give to. That's the trait of chesed. A truly kind person feels unfulfilled and uncomfortable when there is no one to give to. There's no receiver. Gvura, interestingly, more subtly, is about yoker, is really about the value, the preciousness of the thing that there is to give over. In other words, like this. Kindness kindness is all about that the thing that I have should change domains, right? In other words, what I have should enter, what's in my rishus should enter into your rishus. What's in my ownership should enter into your domain, your ownership. That's what it's all about. It's that something should be transferred, right? I should be able to give over. Gvura, or severity, is the idea that the thing that I have to give is so great that you from your end should transform yourself in such a way that you join my domain. Right? In other words, the thing that I have is so profound, is so worthwhile, right? That I'm not going to give it away to you as you are now. You should transform yourself so that you deserve this thing that I have, right? If you lift yourself up, raise yourself up to my level, right? Then you'll be worthy of having this thing that I have. And that's why the two of them are opposites, right? Chesed is the opposite of Gvura. One is all about, I just want to get this thing out of here, right? Like everything, like they have those sales, clearance sale, or closing sale. Everything must go, right? Everything must go. All I want is that everything should just get out of here. That's Chesed, right? Gvura is the exact opposite. Gvura is, this thing is so real and so true and so precious that it's not moving, right? If you want to own it, you should join the store. Sort of, right? In other words, not everything must go. It's instead of everything must go, it's everyone must come. Everyone must arrive. Everyone should lift themselves up, right? Therefore, the two paths of Avraham and Yitzchak. For one thing I'll point out about Chesed and Gvura before I get to Avraham and Yitzchak. One thing I'll point out is that neither of these is really concerned with making sure that the other person, that the receiver, is in a good place or should be able to receive this thing, right? Neither Chesed or Gvura is about the other, really, right? What the person with Chesed says, everything here must go. Who's going to take it? Don't care. Literally don't care who you are. If you show up, I'll hand you something. Take it, please. Chesed, right? Gvura is, listen, they're not going to be able to get it unless they totally transform themselves anyway. So what do I care who they are, right? What do I care where they're coming from, right? The only way they're getting at this thing that I have is in total self-transformation anyway, right? So neither of these both of them are more concerned with the thing that is being given over than with the other person. The other person is really an accessory, is really just there to partake in this truth, either as the one to whom this truth must be given, the truth must be set free, it must be given over, versus a person who will reveal how great this thing is by elevating themselves to a point where they're able to receive it. Okay? Another thing before we get to Avraham and Yitzchak is that Chesed and Gvura, one way to remember this distinction is that Chesed and Gvura are often compared to water and fire. Kindness is water, and Gvura, severity, discipline, authority, judgment, discernment, all different translations. You can tell it's a more complex and difficult to pin down thing because of how many translations there are. Gvura is fire, right? What the fundamental basic difference, it says in every Hasidic discourse, is that water descends, fire ascends, right? Water always finds the lowest place. Fire is always reaching upward. And if you think about it, but if you think about it, the two ways they move are profoundly different, right? Water, when it seeks the lowest place, right, it seeks it totally unchanged, right? In fact, if you wanted to be whimsical, you could hold in your mind, you could hold the raindrop in one place and move the whole world, right? In other words, the raindrop doesn't change, right? All that changes is the context, right? Which is, if you think about it, in Chesed, it's the everything must go sale, right? I just have to get this thing out of here. So in other words, it has to move from me having it to you having it. That's what's important to me. So all that really changes fundamentally is the context, right? Is it in my warehouse or is it in your warehouse? Gvura, fire, the way that fire ascends, as we see in Tanya and many other places in Chassidus, much more complex, right? Fire doesn't ascend by moving from one place to another. The ascension of fire is its self-destruction, right? The flame, as it says in Tanya, wants to pull away from the wick, and we know that if the flame pulls away from the wick, it will cease to shine and cease to burn, right? There's this very profound interplay and dynamics which has to do with this idea that in order to receive from the person who gives in a way of Gvura, you really have to cease being yourself. It's not just a change of reshuyas. It's not going to just a Yitzchak, right, or a Maggid of Mezrich, right? It's in the Chassidus. It's the Baal Shem Tov versus the Maggid of Mezrich, right? They're not just going to hand it to you if you show up, right? The Baal Shem Tov was famous for having, even at his tish, anashim pshutim, very serious, very simple Jews among the great tzaddikim and great students of the great and holy, saintly students of the Baal Shem Tov. They were also very simple people. The Maggid of Mezrich did not travel from town to town and meet with simple people. He stayed in Mezrich, and all of these tzaddikim found their way to him. right? Not so simple for a simple Jew to reach the Maggid of Mezrich, right? You have to cease being what you are, right? And go to become a makabel, go to have bittul, go to nullify yourself before the master of the Maggid of Mezrich. Whereas the Baal Shem Tov, you could literally just be sitting in your village one morning and the Baal Shem Tov shows up, which is the beginning of 1,000 stories, right? Maggid of Mezrich is the opposite. The same with Yitzchak. Yitzchak stays in one place, right? The difference between Avraham and Yitzchak is characterized as Avraham gives over, and this is the difference again between Chesed and Gevura. Avraham gives over milamayla lamata, from above to below. Yitzchak is about milamata lamayla, from below to above. Right? What do we mean? Let's look at Yishmael and Avraham. Right? Avraham gives. Avraham is a man of chesed. He just wants to give what he has, which is primarily the reality of God. That's the main thing Avraham has to give. He wants to give it to everyone, right? Including, of course, his firstborn son, Yishmael, right? He wants to give God and this whole project to Yishmael. When you're operating from above to below, there is an advantage and there is a disadvantage. The advantage is you're able to give, because it all depends on you wanting to give, you can give even to people that are very, very low, right? For example, in Parshas Vayera, we just read recently that Avraham wanted to give kindness and and have hachnasas orchim to people who worship the dust on their own feet, right? Not only did he want to have hachnasas orchim, he sets aside his profound prophetic union with God, which is probably to us completely unimaginable. I wouldn't even know how to begin to conceive of Avraham's relationship with God. Avraham sets aside talking to God 3 days after his bris milah to welcome in guests who worship the dust on their own feet, which, as Rashi explains, is the lowest form of idolatry, and that's why Avraham wants to wash their feet, because they would be bringing their idol, which is the very dust of the earth, into the house if he doesn't wash their feet. So the lowest of the low. Right? In Judaism, you couldn't find a more lowly and despicable person than a person who worshipped the dust of their own feet. I learned this Rashi in Parshas Vayera when I was in, I don't know. I probably read it in the Little Midrash Says this idea, which means I probably learned it when I was 6 years old, right? And I think I still don't entirely understand the exactly what's so low about a person that worships the dust of their own feet.
The idol is so...
I understand.
It's the worst idol.
I understand it's so lowly, but still, I know, but it doesn't sound like, they don't sound like Hamas at first glance. All they do is they worship dust. Okay, they worship this, a bit bizarre. I'm beginning to understand it. It's very, you see what I'm saying? Yeah, yeah. They don't seem like the worst people in the world.
Should be Molech is the worst one.
Yeah, or whatever, something dramatic, something, with that's overtly evil. But this is Rashi's characterization of the lowliest person. I'm beginning to understand it. I think with some metaphors and with some explanation, I can sort of begin to wrap my head around it now, understanding what idolatry is, etc. I'm just saying it's an interesting. There's so much richness, even just in a Rashi that to wrap our heads around. I have a friend who's a shliach on a campus in the United States somewhere. I won't say which, in order to protect the innocents. But he says that when he first moved to his shlichus and he opened his Chabad house on campus, he would always be amazed because he had prepared a whole Torah from the Rebbe about a Rashi on a verse, right? And the students would be so blown away just by the Rashi that he would rarely get to the Hasidic explanation. In other words, the Rashi by itself was so mind-blowing. And so, right, sometimes we take for granted these things. Anyway, I guess that's the message. Avraham, the whole idea of chesed is Avraham can give to anyone. Why can Avraham give to everyone? He can give to everyone because it doesn't depend on who they are. It depends on where Avraham can reach. And Avraham, being Avraham, can reach almost everywhere, pretty much, right? In his greatness, he can reach pretty much anywhere with this message. What's the disadvantage? The advantage is the disadvantage, right? Because it comes from Avraham, therefore it has no reflection on the refinement or the transformation of the one who receives it. because it's all dependent on Avraham, right? It's not a principle in the receiver at all. The receiver can be a lowly person. They can receive from Avraham and truly receive it, truly learn it and understand it and internalize it, but it's still by dint of Avraham. In other words, they didn't do anything to deserve this. They didn't do anything to own this. It's all because of the great light of Avraham. So the advantage is the disadvantage. The advantage is it's able to reach an incredibly low place. What's the disadvantage? The disadvantage is that this is not owned by the receiver at all. The receiver didn't really have to change in any way. It's only mitzad Avraham. And what in fact do you see? You see that after Avraham passes away, his effect slowly diminished over time. Right? Avraham had all these Talmidim and all these students who were true monotheists and true worshippers of the one God, right? And in fact, there's many midrashim and many Torahs about what happened to them and where they went. Some say that they actually founded the religions of India, which is a very interesting idea. The
Tuma.
Yeah, but the thing is that nothing remains of them in the sense of like the Jewish people. Nothing remains of these Talmidim. They all went and ended up, they probably founded half the world's religions in some way or another, right? These ideas, right? This is how some people like to explain how so many of the Eastern religions have so many ideas that sound so similar to Kabbalah, right? So how some people like to explain it because
some people like knowledgeable people.
It's an idea. No. I think fairly knowledgeable people. The question becomes like in the details, right? Is it really a lot of things that you might think could only come through some kind of knowledge of the Kabbalah really don't. They could come through a philosophical appreciation of the world. You just need some very smart philosophers, and you can arrive to many of the same conclusions. It's complicated. There's such an idea. It says they went east, as far as I recall. I think is what it says in the Midrash. The Talmidim of Avraham, right, said we went with gifts and were sent away to the east. I don't know. Make of it what you will. But if you think about it, you had all these students who really were students of Avraham and learned all. Avraham knew the whole Torah, kept the whole Torah. They learned all the details of monotheism and about the one God from Avraham, and then they vanish. They're gone, right? It doesn't persist. And according to Chassidus, there's an explanation for this. It doesn't persist. Why? Because everything that they had was by dint of Avraham. That's the nature of Chesed, right? Avraham wasn't concerned with making them into another Avraham. Avraham was concerned that they take what he had, just take it, right? And he could reach because he is Avraham, he could reach even the lowest person with this. But at the end of the day, why do they have it? Because Avraham, from his end, chose to give it to them, right? It wasn't truly transformative from the inside, such that the student could become another leader, that the student could become another Avraham. That's Avraham's way. Yitzchak is the opposite, and he also has an advantage and a disadvantage. Yitzchak's disadvantage, right, is that because he's in a way of Gvura, and because it's from below to above, it doesn't reach everyone, just like the Maggid of Mezrich, right? It doesn't reach everyone. You have to be willing to receive from Yitzchak. You have to be willing to transform yourself. You have to be willing to change. You, from your end, have to transform yourself and arrive at Yitzchak. By the way, what makes a person who's not at the level of Yitzchak want to transform themselves? If you think about it, it's an interesting question. Because in Chesed,
there has to be some Chesed
right.
for you. Yitzchak has to say, hey, come here.
Very good. Very good. I'd actually put it in a slightly different way. I think what happens is Yitzchak speaks to you and you realize that this is so beyond what I'm able to appreciate that it actually is mevatel you. In other words, it's the feeling of distance. Avraham, it's the feeling of closeness. When Avraham spoke to you, he could speak to you at your level, and you felt like, I already possessed this, was always the feeling. Yitzchak's the opposite. When Yitzchak speaks to you, and you still meet occasionally a rabbi whose whole... or a teacher of any kind, really, whose soul is from the side of Gvura, and you sense this when you talk to them, right? They speak in such a way where you always come away with the impression, I didn't really get what they were saying. It's like so beyond me. And what that does is it creates an impetus, right? But I agree with you. There is definitely a chesed. In a way, maybe this is the chesed.
And also, Abraham has to have somewhat of a gvura because he did wash the dust off their feet.
Very good. And the Akedah famously is the gvura of Avraham, right? So that's the yira. When we say yira, what's fear, right? Gvura is the side of fear. What's the fear, right? Fear, some prefer to translate as awe. There's different levels of fear, right? But fundamentally, what is it? It's in the presence of this thing, I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel...
It's not
There's different things. Yira and Pachad are also two different things. Pachad Yitzchak, though, very good. I think the difference is, I think the Rebbe says in a Sikha that Pachad is from closer, Yira is from far, or the opposite, or there's Ima v'Fachad. I don't remember. Anyway, Yitzchak, that's the fear. What's the fear, right? What is the sense? A fear is the desire to flee, right? Love is a desire to come closer. Fear is you want to run away, right? What's the sense of wanting to run away? When you meet a teacher like this that teaches you, that says things that are so far in every way beyond your level, right? If, by the way, it was truly beyond your level, you'd feel nothing, right? It's in a way where it's beyond you, but you sense that it's beyond you, which is by the way, which is called makif. The makif means it's beyond me, but I can sense that it's beyond me. And what is the sense when you do that? You're uncomfortable, right? That's the discomfort of the sukkah when we're surrounded by the makif, right? We're uncomfortable being in the sukkah because it's not home. That's the sense in which it's not home. We feel that we don't really belong there. We could go off. I'm not going to get too distracted. Okay, you have Yitzchak. Yitzchak's disadvantage is that he can't reach everyone, because the whole idea is if you're going to really receive from Yitzchak, you have to, from your end, you have to lift yourself up. You have to lift yourself up, and not everyone is going to be able to do that. Right? What's the advantage of Yitzchak? The advantage is the disadvantage. What's the advantage? The advantage is that what a person receives from Yitzchak, they have earned on their own, which is why a different thing that's sometimes said about Gvura in Chassidus is that Gvura means you give to only to those who deserve it. Exactly right.
So when
exactly
are you going
right.
to bring the wells into it?
Oh, wells. 1 second, we're getting there.
Oh, we're not at the wells.
No, we are actually at the wells. A very timely question, right? What do you see with the wells? Yitzchak digs the wells, right? Fascinating. The way the Rebbe puts it is beautiful. It's so poetic. Without the Sikha, I wouldn't have seen the parallel, right? Avraham is able to give to people who worship the dust of their feet. Yitzchak digs in the dust, right, and reveals the water that was in and hidden within the dust.
What's
right?
the verse?
What's the verse?
Well, you say dust.
The dust, well, when you dig the well.
No,
Into
but
the,
you said he dug. Where did he dig? Where?
Remember when the angels came and told him, wash your friend.
No, but I'm saying of Yitzchak, what is the?
It's a good question. I don't know if it actually says offer there. It's a good question. I'm not sure. I have to look it up.
I never thought. Oh, okay.
But Yitzchak digs into the dirt, right? He digs into the earth. And what does he do? Instead of giving over to someone that's at a level where they worship the earth, he turns the earth itself, so to speak, into a place where you can draw water and life from the earth, right? In other words, the whole idea is it's the transformation. It's milamata lamaila. It's from below to above. It's the transformation of what's below. You elevate the thing itself until it's ready and a worthy recipient. You work on the dust until the dust becomes a kli, a vessel, a well, a source of life.
It's funny because this has to do with water, which we said Yitzchak had to do with fire.
Yeah. Good point.
Fire of Yitzchak was the Akeda.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Good point. I didn't even think of that. The Rebbe doesn't mention it. It's an interesting point. I don't know. Good question.
What's the fire of Abraham? That's
Interesting idea. The heat of the day. I don't know. It's an interesting question. I didn't see the Sikha does not say that fire and water. I'm telling you that mitzad from elsewhere that Chesed and Gevurah are associated with water and fire, respectively. But I'm not sure how they play out in the stories of the others. Interesting question.
Well, we know that Yishmael has a lot of stuff to do with water. Because in the desert with the water.
Yeah, good point. Very good point. Yeah.
This is what Gladstein was mentioning.
Oh, yeah.
Always give him a little bit of water.
Yeah.
Not too much water.
Right.
This is chesed of klipa.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. So when you understand this difference between Avraham and Yitzchak, you see that it produces two different results, and it makes sense what results they produce in Yishmael and Eisav. Right. Avraham gives to Yishmael. What does that mean? It means Yishmael doesn't become another Avraham. Yishmael is not a Jew. He doesn't become Avraham, because everything that Yishmael has, he receives only in a way of chesed, right? He receives not in this transformative way where he has to change. Avraham gives to him in a way of chesed, right? That's the disadvantage, is that Yishmael is doesn't become a Jew. What's the advantage? The advantage is that Avraham can reach him wherever he is. And therefore, by the end of his life, Avraham, by working on it, is able to bring him to do tshuva. Because Avraham can lift him up, right? That light, that teaching of Avraham can reach anyone, right? Even a Yishmael. So in the end, Yishmael does tshuva. Eisav, on the other hand, in this week's parsha, Eisav you have the advantage of Gvura. What's the advantage of Gvura? The advantage of Gvura is that because he's the Toldos of his father Yitzchak, because he comes from Yitzchak, they have a fundamental and essential transformation of the matter, right? He has an inner transformation, an inner holiness that he gets from his father, that is really his, that actually really belongs to him. He's born a Jew. He has this profound transformation from the tzad of Gvura, right, where it actually is his. Eisav actually does own and possess holiness that can never be removed from him, no matter how much he rebels against it. What's the disadvantage? The disadvantage is that because Yitzchak cannot reach anyone, right? And you can take this and you can take your inherent potential and squander it and waste it, right? Eisav reaches a point where Yitzchak is not really able to reach him. And therefore, in the end, he doesn't really do tshuva. Yeah, he doesn't really repent. Which brings us to the story of this week's parsha. Why does Yitzchak want to give the blessing to Eisav? This is really the question around which all the Rebbe's sichos about Eisav revolve, right? This is the real question. The real question is first of all, how could you really get a bad apple from Yitzchak? Yeah, it doesn't even make sense. The Avos are Merkava of God, right? They're purely batel, and nothing they do is ever against the will of Hashem, and yet they have these children who are no good. How's it even possible, right? And the answer is that really they're not so no good, right? It went wrong, but it wasn't wrong fundamentally. There was nothing wrong in essence, and that's what we say about Yitzchak and Eisav. Yitzchak sees in Eisav a tremendous and profound potential, and he doesn't want to give up on it, right? And Yitzchak is hoping that through the bracha, right, he can elevate and transform Eisav and take advantage of this profound and inherent connection, right, where Eisav is born with this neshama. Eisav is born a Jew. What does Yitzchak do? He wants to place his hands on Eisav's, when you give a bracha, head. Right? What part of Eisav ends up buried with Yitzchak? His head, right? The Rebbe says that Eisav, if you remove his head from his body, right? In other words, if you free his upper part from the guf, from the body and the earthliness that's master, that covers over, right? Eisav has so much good in him. He has good in him, he has profound good in him, right? His head, in other words, his connection to his source, right? The part of the person that looks upward, that looks towards what's holy, right, is still there. There's still, even at the end, even though he's against and fights against and is in total opposition to the end of his life, to holiness, right? Even so, his head is still, there's still holiness there. There's still a spark. There's still godliness within it, even though he's fighting against and is covered over this holiness, from which the Rebbe takes the profound lesson that if Yitzchak was still trying with the Mumar Yisrael, Eisav, who was a real no-goodnik, yeah, it's not beyond us to try with any Jew nowadays, especially since every Jew nowadays is not bad from their own fault, right? They didn't have a Yitzchak to raise them and teach them about Judaism, right? No one today did. Everyone that's bad nowadays, Rubam Kakulam, as the Rebbe says, are Taneka Shenishbu, are not responsible for their bad behavior in any way. And so therefore, if a Yitzchak could still reach out to Eisav, we should be able to reach out to any Jew, no matter how they are. And the Rebbe says, as long as you remember that the whole idea is you have to lift them up to Torah, not vice versa, right? The whole idea is you have to bring them close. You don't have to, you mustn't make compromises in Torah and bring it down to them. Exactly. You lift up the kids to kiss the mezuzah. Very beautiful. We have to lift it. We can do that for all the Jews we know. I just want to finish with a thought about Yaakov, because really, we would be remiss if we didn't talk about Yaakov, right? What's Yaakov? Yaakov's Tiferes, right? What's Tiferes? Tiferes is normally translated as beauty. And Tiferes is Chesed and Gvura put together, right? But as my one of my mashpiyim says, not with Scotch tape, right? In other words, it's not you tape Chesed to Gvura and somehow you get a Tiferes. Tiferes is the true blending of Chesed and Gvura into a new thing, into a third thing. Yaakov has the advantages of both Avraham and Yitzchak. That's why it's the Bechor of the Avos, the chosen of the Avos. Bechir, pardon me. Yaakov has the advantages of both. How do you see this? Yaakov is not confined to Eretz Yisrael, right? The whole idea of Yitzchak being unable to leave Eretz Yisrael is the quality of Gevura, right? Because you can't reach everyone with your life is not a wandering life. People must come to you. You stay in your place of holiness. It's not for you can't have an effect out in these impure places, right? Yaakov goes everywhere. Yaakov wanders. Yaakov goes to the house of Lavan. He's all over. Then later he goes to Mitzrayim. Yaakov is all over. Wanders all over, just like his grandfather Avraham, right? But Yaakov's effect is not an effect that is a temporary chesed effect where it doesn't elevate the receiver. It elevates the receiver as well. And how do you see that? Because as the Rebbe says over and over about Yaakov, mitosai shlema, right? All of his kids end up keeping the faith. They end up being righteous, right? Which of course leads to the question of how can they all be righteous? It seems there's some very unrighteous stories about them, but we say that about a lot of people in Torah. It's a different whole discussion for a different time. In the end of the day, whether they're personally righteous or not, they're in the fold, right? The Jewish people come from them. The Jewish people come from all the children of Yaakov. There's no child of Yaakov that is not part of the people, right? And no child of Yaakov has a rebellion against the people like Eisav does, right? At the end of the day, whether their personal righteousness set aside, right? Therefore, mitosai shlema, right? His bed was complete. Yaakov was able to make a permanent foundation for all of his descendants to be part of the people. And that becomes Am Yisrael, of course. That becomes the Hebrews and the entire nation, right? All the tribes all come from Yaakov and Yisrael. So Yaakov has the advantage of both. He's able to go out to the lowest place, right? And in that lowest place, he's able to make a transformation that's not just from above to below, a transformation that truly transforms the mata and the lowest place. What's the trait associated with Yaakov? There's two. One is emes Hashem Yaakov, and one is rachamim, one is mercy. The difference between mercy versus kindness and gevura is that mercy actually is interested in the other person. That's the secret of mercy, right? Mercy, you can. By the way, we didn't even go into this, but you could look at each one as the tolda of one of the three, the gimel meichin, right? In other words, you have chesed comes from chachma, gvura comes from bina, right? And tiferes comes from das. It's the kava yamina, kava smala, and the kava emtsoy. No, the opposite. In fact, the opposite. MS. It's complicated, but the opposite. Right, Moshe is associated with Yaakov, right? A different descendant and inheritor of Yaakov. Yaakov, the whole idea of mercy is that mercy actually is concerned with the other person receiving. Mercy is like an elastic band, right? Or the, which one is it? Is it the strong nuclear force or the weak nuclear force? I forget. But the idea is that unlike chesed and gvura, which are concerned about what happens to the thing that I have to give, right? Mercy is, I see that the other person is distant from me, right? But because it's not about the thing that I'm giving, but about them, I'm going to reach them and help them where they are or where they aren't. I'm going to be able to reach them, which is why what you really want from Hashem is not chesed, right? You want either mercy or you want sweetened gvuros, which is a similar idea, right? It's a whole other profound idea. But you want mercy, because mercy is the idea that the giver doesn't just overcome The giver overcomes all the limitations of connecting. He finds a way to truly connect in a transformative way. That's really what mercy is. It's about the receiver, right? It's not just that it's good in some abstract sense because it helps the giver give, or because it maintains the preciousness and the loftiness of the thing that's being given. It's good in the sense of the receiver can see that it's good. The receiver is transformed. And really, this comes from Das, because Das in the Meichin, what precedes Tiferes in the middle row of the spheres, in the famous map of the spheres with the three vertical rows of spheres, right? So Tiferes comes from Das. Tiferes comes from Das. Das is connection, right? In other words, the part of the mind that allows you to internalize and make real the things that you are learning and make them a true reality in your life, right, gives birth to an emotional quality, a relational quality, right, of placing the needs of the other first, right? It's born of that connection. And the truth is that MS is the same idea. Truth is the same idea, because in Chesed and Gevura, right, ultimately, the place that the teaching is able to reach is all determined by the quality of the teacher and the teaching, right? Things that are true, right? Things that are true everywhere, mekol tzad upina. In other words, the reason the truth is able to reach everyone is because the nature of truth is that everyone is part of the truth. The true part of everyone is part of the truth. In other words, or a different way of putting it is, the truth negates the idea of a giver and a receiver ultimately, right? The giver and the receiver are just two parts of one truth. That's what truth is, right? Truth is, that's what Das is as well, right? We don't, it's the two of us become an us. We become a we become your reality. My reality is part of your reality is part of my reality. There's a hiskalalus and a unity, right? The beauty of Tiferes is the beauty of multiple colors in harmony, right? Some translate Tiferes as harmony, because it's this whole idea that the distinction is not really the ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is unity. That's the truth. And that unity of all things is called the truth, is called MS. MS means it's the same everywhere that it is, right? So you and I are really just manifestations of the same thing, the same truth. So truth and unity and beauty, right, all go together. So Yaakov has the advantage of both Avraham and Yitzchak, and that's why Yaakov, the forefather Jacob, does not produce an Eisav or a Yishmael. Okay, to be continued next week.